Mr. President.
Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following senators be. Mr. President, I move to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following senators be permitted to speak prior to the scheduled roll call votes. Young for up to 5 minutes, Warnock for up to 5 minutes, Cassidy for up to 10 minutes, Wyden for up to 15 minutes, Paul for up to 20 minutes, Shaheen for up to 5 minutes, Blumenthal for up to 10 minutes, and Risch for up to 5 minutes. Mr. President. Mr. President, Russia has been condemned for years, but what it has not yet faced is a cost high enough to change its course. Senator Lindsey Graham understood that. The bill he left us, his final legislative legacy, does not stop at symbolic penalties or mere gestures. It's a strategy. It's a strategy to impose real costs on those sustaining Russia's war machine. Lindsey, who was a friend of mine, understood what it would take. Not another statement of outrage, but a serious plan. A plan to make continuing this war more costly than ending it. And it starts with an uncomfortable truth. We cannot choke off the war chest while Russia's largest customers keep replenishing it, even as those same governments insist they want the war to end. The United States, however, has leverage, enormous leverage. Access to our market carries enormous weight. Our allies know this. Our adversaries know it, and the governments buying Russian energy certainly know it. But we should remember that tariff threats of this magnitude do not stop at the doors of a foreign ministry. They have real-world consequences. They can reach factory floors, farms, small businesses, and family budgets here at home. That doesn't mean we shouldn't act. We should act. But if Americans might absorb some of these costs, they deserve a policy that is transparent, disciplined, and tied to well-defined objectives. That's why Congress has a responsibility to ensure that these authorities remain focused on their intended purpose with clear standards governing when additional pressure is warranted and when demonstrated progress should be recognized. The bipartisan support for this legislation sends a clear and a very important message. The pressure authorized here is directed at the countries financing Russia's war and must remain tied to that mission. Full stop. The goal and the result Congress should demand is a race to the bottom among Russia's largest energy buyers, with each country competing to cut its purchases faster than the others. But a race only works when every participant knows the rules, when every participant understands the objective and trusts that meaningful action will be recognized. If countries buy more Russian energy, if they conceal transaction, or if they help Moscow evade sanctions, well, the president has every right to increase pressure. And I'll have my encouragement. At the same time, if countries cut those purchases, stop enabling Russia, and demonstrate that change with real evidence, our policy should respond accordingly. That is how leverage produces action, instead of simply imposing costs. And as this legislation moves forward through the process, I look forward to working with Chairman Crapo and the administration to keep these tariff authorities focused and on the threats Congress intends to confront, the very threats Lindsey Graham worked so hard to confront. This bill presents a simple proposition. Countries may finance Russia's war, or they may enjoy the benefits of access to the U.S. market, but they shouldn't expect to do both without consequences. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I urge unanimous consent to enter this letter from U.S. Trade Representative Greer into the congressional record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this letter restricts the President's tariff authority under the Lindsey O. Graham Sanctioning Russia and Iran Act. This is a small but meaningful victory for all Americans who continue to suffer under this president's reckless tariffs. Let's be clear, Putin is a war criminal, and his war machine must be stopped. But we should not have to choose between putting a check on Putin's aggression and putting a check on this president's tariff regime. That is a false choice, and it is one that I am not willing to accept. And so I hope in the coming hours that we go further during the amendment process. I hope my colleagues will join me in stripping out any new presidential tariff authorities. These are not normal times. This is not a normal president. If you give him an inch, he will take a mile. We don't have to imagine, we are seeing it in real time. And everyday people, as a result of that, are struggling to buy groceries, struggling to buy gas, struggling to buy their kids back-to-school supplies. They are the ones who are suffering the consequences of his reckless tariff regime. But this commitment that we were able to get from Ambassador Greer is meaningful, because if the president ignores the law, if he oversteps his power, we will see him in court. I hope this week-long process was the first step in Congress reasserting its role and placing guardrails on this president's tariff regime. I urge my colleagues to go back home and talk to ordinary folks outside of the Beltway. They will tell you that while they support any efforts to protect our national security, and that's what this is about. This isn't just about Ukraine, it is about our own national security. But we must do everything to protect our national security while at the same time bolstering the economic security of everyday Americans. So as we go back home, ask any parent you meet how much back-to-school shopping cost them this year. I can tell you as the father of 2 small children that it is much more than they wanted to spend. When we come back to Washington, we can fight for those parents and build on this work to check the power of this reckless president. But I'm glad that we've gotten as far as we have on this issue. I'd like to thank my friend and brother, Senator Cassidy, for your partnership in this amendment process. And I'd like to thank Senator Shaheen and Blumenthal for their efforts to find a solution and a way forward to support Ukraine, to protect our national security and our economic security at the same time. And with that, I yield back.
The senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak to the nomination of Todd Blanche to be Attorney General. Over the last several days, I've heard from lots of people sharing their views on this nomination. And most of the time, it's clear. Mr. Blanche has become a referendum on how people feel about President Trump. If you don't like the president, you don't like Mr. Blanche. If you do like the president, you do. I have not approached it that way. This process should be about Mr. Blanche and how he will go forward in a difficult job and how the American people can be best served. I have a history with Mr. Trump, but that history does not matter one bit. On the one hand, Mr. Blanche does not need to be Senate confirmed. He can continue to serve at the pleasure of the President as Deputy Attorney General or even Acting Attorney General if this vote is pulled. On the other hand, I am told that Senate confirmation is important in interactions with the President, with others in the Cabinet, and is important to DOJ employees in general. Being Senate confirmed gives him greater leverage to push for things that should be pushed for. This does not demean the Senate's role. Important issues have been discussed through this process, and Mr. Blanche has made commitments. Now on to the specific nomination. Since Mr. Blanche passed out of Judiciary Committee on August the 4th, I've spoken to Mr. Blanche 5 or 6 times. We have texted many more. I just got off the phone with him. I've spoken multiple times to Senators Murkowski, Cornyn, Tillis. Senator Whitehouse shared his concerns. Additionally, I spoke with current and past administration officials, including a long conversation with former Attorney General Bill Barr. Late last night, I spoke to 2 U.S. attorneys from Louisiana, David Corsell and Kurt Wall. Of course, there's been a lot to read and a lot to consider, and I slept on it overnight. Let's start with the concerns. Mr. Blanche showed poor judgment in approving the anti-weaponization slush fund and exempting the President from IRS audits. No American should be unfairly targeted by the law, but no American should be above the law. Mr. Blanche said these were mistakes, and he has made efforts to kill the slush fund. I am particularly concerned about episodes of apparent lawfare. DOJ bringing suits against political enemies. Both parties, presidents of both parties, have been guilty of this. It must stop. It should stop now. A never-ending cycle of prosecuting political enemies undermines the rule of law, degrades the public's trust in our institutions, and makes our politics more extreme when we need to unite to solve the big problems of our time. I'm not entirely satisfied where this is, and I have no doubt that I'll have concern in the future. I will note that I've learned that some of the cases that have been publicly reported to be under investigation by the Department of Justice have been dismissed or are no longer being pursued. I am realistic that President Trump can be unrelenting on this, but this will be true no matter who the Attorney General is, and this is the rationale for having a Senate-confirmed Attorney General with more leverage to push back. I will also note that Mr. Blanche is criticized for things over which he has no control. He points out that he has been criticized for presidential pardons given to January 6 rioters, some of whom assaulted police officers. Many of us were here then. But this is a presidential prerogative, and he is not the president. He also points out that he can advise the president, but the president is not obligated to take his advice. That is the same thing that former Attorney General Barr said in a separate conversation. And Mr. President, I can absolutely believe that President Trump at times would not take advice. But even critics admit that Mr. Blanche knows the law and is a hands-on administrator. He has instructed U.S. attorneys to focus on violent crime, human and drug trafficking, and fraud in programs like Medicare and Medicaid. Mr. Corsell, the U.S. Attorney in New Orleans, says that when he needed extra resources, Acting Attorney General Blanche provided them to finish a big drug case. Both Mr. Corsell and Mr. Wall said that DOJ has accountability measures for each prosecutor in their office, and that there are weekly calls between their offices and DOJ to review the performance of each prosecutor. That morale was high, not despite the accountability measures, but because of the accountability measures. More cases were being processed and convictions being obtained. David Corsell spoke of almost $1 billion in fraud being recovered for the U.S. taxpayer from health care fraud. Both men said that having a permanent Senate-confirmed Attorney General was important. I cannot overstate Mr. Wall's and Mr. Corsell's support for Mr. Blanche. When former Attorney General Bill Barr endorsed Mr. Blanche, he said Mr. Blanche will run the department as effectively as anyone can under President Trump. Some have called that faint praise. I don't think that it is. I think it is a reality. Barr specifically addressed the allegation that Mr. Blanche would be a yes man for the president. He said that any attorney to represent a client well has to have tough conversations and confront a client with difficult truths. That because of his previous attorney-client relationship with President Trump, Mr. Blanche would be precisely the person to push back on President Trump. But that ultimately, and here Barr echoed what I heard from Blanche, decisions are made by the president. Mr. Blanche is not perfect, and he will tell you this, but the choice is not between perfection and Mr. Blanche. It is between Mr. Blanche and another acting attorney general who may not run the department effectively under President Trump and who indeed may not be as good as Mr. Blanche. This puts at risk the progress made fighting violent crime, human and drug trafficking, and fraud. And this does not serve the American people well. This is not a referendum on President Trump. It is a decision regarding Mr. Blanche in very specific circumstances. All considered, I will vote for Mr. Blanche. I'll be criticized for this vote. What's new? But the people of Louisiana can be assured that I worked hard to understand the issue and to make the right decision. With that, I yield.
President,
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, I fully support taking tougher action against Russia. They have waged a deadly, years-long war on Ukraine, and the United States must do more to tighten the screws on the Putin war machine. So I am fully in favor of strong sanctions. But this bill, despite its title, is not just a sanctions bill. It gives Donald Trump massive new tariff authority that he can use to threaten our trading partners and raise prices on the American people. I believe senators will come to deeply regret voting to give Donald Trump this tariff authority. This bill gives Trump so much discretion that he can ultimately decide what countries to tariff or what countries to exempt. He can modify tariffs at his will. Over the last year and a half, Americans have seen what Donald Trump will do with unchecked tariff authority. They have seen his tariffs raise prices for Americans and their families on everything from food to housing to health care. Americans have seen small businesses and family farms shut down because they cannot afford massive new taxes on machinery and merchandise. The Trump tariffs go on again and off again, disrupting supply chains and making it difficult for businesses to plan, invest, and hire. Our allies, including Canada and the EU, openly question the reliability of our nation and are looking to other countries for more stable trade relationships. As Trump turns the tariff dial up and down to punish or reward countries as he likes, the process ends up being a corrupt taxing of the American people to settle Trump personal political scores. If Congress passes this bill with these tariffs, members will be condoning the tariff chaos of the last year and a half and inviting more. This bill gives Trump clear authority to put tariffs up to 100% on the goods Americans buy from major trading partners around the globe. That includes 100% tariffs on things like food, medicine, machinery, and electronics. Congress would even be letting Trump put tariffs on allies like Hungary, Slovakia, France, Belgium, and Japan. Donald Trump can pick and choose even more countries to tariff every 180 days. That's because there is no mechanism in this bill, none whatsoever, for Congress to roll back the Trump tariffs. Trump can increase or decrease tariffs just by notifying the Congress of his decision. He's not going to be constrained by any kind of paperwork or rules. Colleagues, this body has been fighting tooth and nail to stop Trump from abusing the laws already on the books. Trump has shown us repeatedly he won't be limited by the spirit of the law. He'll use any loophole to slap tariffs on our allies and make life more expensive for Americans. The Trump tariffs are now raising prices, hurting our alliances, and opening the door to corruption. This bill will further increase the cost of living for American families when they're struggling. So all of my colleagues who've said, look, we want to hold down the cost of living, we want to make life more affordable, this is not going to do that. This is going to increase the cost of living for Americans as we go into the next few months. It'd be a nightmare for the Americans who want to see their government tackle the affordability crisis. It would be a dangerous mistake to sign our names on a blank check that gives Trump even more power to to indiscriminately use these tariffs. So I urge my colleagues this morning to support the Paul Wyden amendment, which would strike this new tariff authority. It would make sure that we're not giving Trump power to tax our constituents for the things they buy from trading partners around the world. There is no need to include this new tariff in the bill. And the fact that the White House won't support the bill without new tariff powers should scare every senator in this room. Trump has shown over the last year and a half that he can't be trusted with unilateral power on tariffs. Everything he's done suggests that he's going to abuse this power, and I urge my colleagues this morning to vote yes on the Paul Wyden amendment to prevent this body from handing Donald Trump a new tool for inflation and corruption. I yield the floor.
President,
Senator from Kentucky.
increasing taxes on Americans will not end Putin's war in Ukraine. The drafters of this legislation understandably wish to punish Vladimir Putin and send Russian invaders back to where they came from. But this bill was written such that the drafters fail to see that it will not bring peace to Ukraine, but rather will deliberately make American families poorer by increasing tariffs, which are nothing but a tax on imported goods. To save Americans from what very well could be the largest tax increase imposed by a Republican Congress, I offer an amendment that strikes the authority to impose tariffs of up to 100% on an ever-changing list of countries. Mark my words, this will be the largest tax increase by a Republican Congress. Why would Republicans who promise you they want to lower your taxes be voting to raise your taxes $500 billion? In addition, Congress should not delegate its constitutional duties to the executive branch. Now, my amendment does not touch the sanctions, the broad sanctions that are provided by the bill, nor does it touch the specific tariffs on Russia, because I see the strong desire among members of the Senate to use economic warfare against Putin. But I object to economic warfare against the American consumer. Once upon a time, Republicans were distinguished from Democrats by their persistent chant that the U.S. deficit was the result of a spending problem, not a revenue problem. Yet today, many Republicans have become the cheerleaders for more revenue. The bill before us grants the executive branch the power to raise nearly $500 billion in revenue, in taxes. I hope I am not the only Republican left in Congress who is horrified by a bill that proposes to raise taxes $500 billion. In addition, there is the constitutional question. Can Congress delegate its Article 1, Section 8 authority to lay taxes and levies? Can they just give it away to the executive branch? For 100 years or more, the Supreme Court has said we can't give away our power, and in what world would we want to give away our power? The power to tax and spend was given to Congress. Why would they give that to the president? What sort of feckless Congress gives away their constitutional power? The power was divided for a reason. Montesquieu said, if you bring the legislative powers together with the executive, you'll have no liberty. The powers were divided between the legislature and the executive so we could fight for liberty, so it would make it hard to raise taxes. The answer, can Congress give away its power, is an unequivocal no. Embedded within our Constitution is something called the non-delegation principle, which states that Congress cannot delegate its core legislative powers to another branch of government or to private entities. The Supreme Court used to enforce this non-delegation doctrine, most notably in the Schechter poultry case. But that case was decided in 1935, and for much of the intervening years, the Supreme Court has been a reliable ally to lazy legislators. Up until recently, the Supreme Court effectively relieved Congress from the hard work of legislating. But the tide is turning, frankly, with the help of several of President Trump's nominees. Justice Gorsuch forcefully made the case for reviving the non-delegation principle by arguing that if Congress could pass off its legislative power to the executive branch, legislation would risk becoming nothing more than the will of the current president. The problem with this legislation is that it disobeys the clear command of the Constitution. Taxes and levies must be determined by Congress. Moreover, taxation bills must originate in the House of Representatives. Do not let sympathy for Ukraine blind you to the reality of tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imports that are paid by Americans. They are paid by parents trying to provide for their families. They are paid by students saving up to buy their first car. Tariffs are paid by anyone who seeks to spend money on any conceivable product. There will be those who will try to pull the wool over your eyes and tell you that despite this persistent sticker shock, despite the feeling that life just keeps getting more and more expensive, the tariffs are always paid by somebody else, by some foreign country. The members who vote for this tax will tell you not to worry, these tariffs will only be levied on foreign countries. This absurd claim is provably false. Figuring out who pays tariffs is easy. All you have to do is look at those who are getting refunds. When the Supreme Court struck down the tariffs, a whole bunch of people lined up for refunds. Who's not on the list? The Chinese government's not on the list. Canada's not on the list. Mexico's not on the list. American companies are getting the refunds because Americans pay tariffs. And do you think the company pays the tariffs? No, they pass it along to the consumer. You're all paying higher prices. Every time you get something through retail, you're paying higher prices. The entities that lined up for the rebates after the Supreme Court struck down the emergency tariffs were primarily American retailers such as Walmart, Target, Costco, Nike. Let me repeat, China is not on the refund list because China doesn't pay the tariffs. American importers and retailers pay the tariffs, and they pass the cost of the tariffs on to the consumer. You don't have to take my word for it. A letter was sent to the Senate Republican and Democrat leaders by 24 industry associations, including the Chamber of Commerce, the Consumer Technology Association, the National Retail Association, warning about the cost of tariffs imposed by this bill. Here are some quotes from industry concerned about these new taxes. The potential of a new broad 100% tariff on imports from secondary countries risks raising costs for American businesses, workers, and consumers. These new tariffs, that approach would effectively tax U.S. importers and consumers for foreign governments' energy decisions, conduct that is outside the control of the American companies. They further say tariffs of this scale would increase costs for everyday consumer goods, manufacturing inputs, and other products, while creating significant uncertainty for companies making, sourcing, pricing, and inventory decisions for months on end. It could also lead to retaliatory tariffs against U.S. exports. So it doesn't necessarily help exports to tax imports because the other countries then will tax our exports. Tariffs are a blunt tool, they say, that can penalize law-abiding U.S. companies importing legitimate goods, invite retaliation, complicate trade negotiations, and shift costs onto American families without ensuring that pressure reaches the intended actors. These 24 associations end their letter by saying, we urge Congress to remove the tariff authority from the bill and instead focus on targeted sanctions, stronger enforcement against sanction evasion, and coordinated diplomacy with countries purchasing Russian energy. Anybody concerned with the economic well-being of American families would come to the same conclusion, but it's not easy to find such common sense in Congress. Imposing a 100% tariff on all goods imported from countries like China and India is the economic equivalent of shooting ourselves in the foot. Middle and low-income Americans enjoy a higher quality of life when they have more purchasing power for everyday necessities. Recent tariffs are estimated to have already cost the average American family $1,700. So the average American family is already paying $1,700 more because of these taxes that are placed on the things you buy. Now this Republican Congress, after it just gave the American people tax cuts, is going to do the opposite. Which is it? Are we the party of lower taxes or higher taxes? This will be the largest tax increase in recent history, perhaps the largest tax increase that a Republican Congress has put onto the people. What are we going to say to the parents buying their kids new shoes for school year? The minimum wage worker who needs to buy a new part to fix their car to get to work? Or the single mother buying diapers when they notice that their prices have doubled? The costs of the tariffs are not strictly monetary. These tariffs threaten to undermine America's strategic position in the world. Some naively think that the tariffs will get China to distance themselves from Russia. But it might be the opposite. Recent history suggests that they will instead push Russia and China together. China's not going to get this 100% tariff and say, oh, we're sorry. We're no longer going to cooperate with Russia. We've kind of forced Russia to give us this great deal on oil and gas that we pipe into our country, but we're sorry now and we're going to give up on that. No, it's going to push them closer together. The people that we are worried about are going to become more allied. Slapping a 100% tariff on China may inadvertently solidify the geopolitical alignment with Russia, as Beijing will become more, not less, reliant on Moscow for economic and diplomatic support. Ryan Young is a senior economist with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He points out that Russia is the junior partner in the alliance with China. Young reminds us that China agreed to a second natural gas pipeline between the two countries on the condition that Russia sell China its gas at a lower than market rate. You think China's going to give up on that? No, China will continue to buy its oil and gas from Russia after this, and they in all likelihood will respond to our tariffs with tariffs of their own. This is what's going to happen. It is not going to solve the situation. It's going to raise American taxes, drive Russia and China together, and then China will actually add tariffs on our goods as well. It's a huge mistake. Imposing tariffs on China will reignite the trade war. Beijing will certainly retaliate with their own tariffs and export controls. Maya Nicolazzi, the Deputy Director of the Economic Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council, reminded us that on Liberation Day, the tariffs placed on China in April 2025 didn't change Beijing's behavior. Instead, those tariffs prompted China to restrict exports of critical rare earth elements. We already tried this once. They responded by restricting their exports of things we need to make batteries for cars, and then we eventually ended up negotiating lower tariffs. Do we want to go through the same world of that again? Likewise, imposing a 100% tariff on India at a time when we are actively trying to court them to help us in our competition with China is completely self-defeating. Ryan Young with the Competitive Enterprise Institute worries that imposing tariffs on India will alienate one of the most important strategic partners in Asia and a potential counterweight to China. So as we try to get India to be more aligned with us instead of with China or Russia, admirable goals, we put tariffs on India, and what does that do? It pushes them more towards China and more towards Russia. It is also unclear if tariffs could even be imposed on individual members of the European Union, like Slovakia and Hungary, given Europe's common trade policy. In 2025, U.S.-EU bilateral trade was over $1 trillion. That is making both parties rich. We have become extraordinarily rich as a country as international trade has expanded. In fact, prosperity of the individual, prosperity of the country is directly proportional to the amount of trade. Think about that. Trying to tariff individual EU countries directly undermines President Trump's recent U.S.-EU trade agreement. Should the EU retaliate against the U.S., the result will be disastrous for both American businesses and consumers. I encourage my colleagues to support my amendment that strips the counterproductive tariffs from the legislation. If not adopted, Congress should reject this strategic blunder of a bill that will do nothing to bring peace to Ukraine, but rather raise American prices for American consumers, further weaken the dollar, destroy U.S. relations around the globe, and drive our adversaries closer together. I recommend a yes vote on the Paul Wyden amendment.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oregon.
just very briefly, my colleague has hit a number of key points, and to close, I just want to make a couple of points. The American people who are following this debate, I'm sure, think that stuff can be corrected, stuff can be changed, and the reality is, under this particular bill, Congress has no authority to modify this deeply flawed piece of legislation. So the reality is, in the next few months, when we've got folks who are walking an economic tightrope here in America, balancing the food bill against the fuel bill and the fuel bill against the rent bill and the like, they're going to come to their elected officials and say, I'm getting pounded by these new tariffs. I'm just getting hit by an economic wrecking ball. Do something about it. Under this legislation, Congress cannot modify this bill. It's just not possible. So what we're going to have to do is make sure that the American people get some additional attention in other areas of the economy, because under this legislation and under these tariffs, they are going to get hit by an economic wrecking ball. And it is an unforced error that doesn't have to happen. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, shortly we will vote on the Russia sanctions bill, as we have come to call it, and I want to begin by thanking my colleagues for their overwhelming support for this measure, and in particular to thank Senators Shaheen, Britt, Wicker, Risch, Coons, Whitehouse, Durbin, and of course, Senators Schumer and Thune. Their help has been invaluable as we reach this important moment. Last week, with President Zelensky watching from the gallery, this body sent a powerful message to Vladimir Putin and all who are supporting him with funding for his vicious, bloodthirsty, illegal war against the brave, free people of Ukraine. Today, President Zelensky is watching from Ukraine. And Putin is watching from Moscow. I would like to think that Lindsey Graham is watching too. And I know how proud he would be of his sister today, who has taken his place on the floor and has been such a profoundly strong and effective advocate for this bill. Today we say to the people of Ukraine, you are not alone. And we say to Vladimir Putin, you will not conquer Ukraine. You will not defeat this free, brave people who are turning the tide against your bloodthirsty aggression. Nearly 2 years ago, Lindsey Graham and I began working on this bill, but really the journey began with our first trip to Ukraine together some 4 years ago. Robert Frost once said, when he was asked how he began his poems, he said, a poem begins with a lump in the throat. Our journey toward this bill began with a lump in our throats and tears in our eyes when we visited Bucha. Not long after, the Russians were pushed out of that small town just kilometers away from President Zelensky's bunker, which we also visited on that trip just weeks after Ukraine succeeded in pushing them out. We saw the mass grave where Putin's military shot innocent women and children in the back of their heads. We talked to Ukrainian troops who lost limbs, loved ones who lost sons and daughters, fathers and mothers. We talked to children who were kidnapped by Putin, literally abducted and placed in education camps. And on one of those long train rides, we took 6 or 7 trips into Ukraine together. We began thinking about this bill to impose scorching sledgehammer sanctions and tariffs on Ukraine to stop the flow of money fueling Putin's war machine, money that was essential to his slaughterous aggression against Ukraine. And like one of those trains, the journey to this bill was filled with a lot of bumps, a lot of stops and starts. And through it all, what sustained us, as much as anything, was Senator Graham's overwhelming sense of optimism, his sense of humor, his belief in freedom and democracy, his belief in America. And so this bill is a tribute to him. We disagreed about many issues, he and I could be on the receiving end of his anger as well as his praise. But the partnership that we forged, I think, is a lesson, without exaggerating it, to perhaps the people of America that, yes, we can work together and accomplish good things for the world. One of Senator Graham's final acts as a member of this body was to reach an accord with the White House on our behalf and secure the president's support. He died literally the next day. I spoke to him shortly before his death, and I know as well as anyone that this chamber, this body will not be the same without him. We miss him, and this bill, named in his honor, carries on the work that he believed was so important. It will impose scorching sanctions on the Russia war machine and the shadow fleet that sustains it. It will prevent critical resources from flowing to the Kremlin's coffers. It will authorize the president to impose duties and penalties on the largest purchasers of Russian crude oil and natural gas, punishing the profiteers for buying discounted energy products and pushing them to decrease purchases. It is a powerful deterrent against complicity in Putin's illegal war. And it provides a powerful pressure point in stopping buyers of Russian oil and gas from continuing to provide the essential fuel for that war machine. It will give the administration the tools it needs to punish anyone who aids Russia as they continue to evade United States sanctions and promote stronger, stricter enforcement of those sanctions. For years, countries have been allowed to permit bad actors to broker deals and support the shadow fleet's movement all around the world. They have become fabulously rich while preaching the need for peace. These countries will be exposed as facilitating evasion of sanctions, and it will help us end the war. The goal is peace. We have the power to help end this war, and we cannot stand idly as a young democratic nation desperately fights for its survival against a murderous dictator. We know from history, appeasement is a failed hope, and hope is not a strategy. We cannot appease Putin in the hope that he will abandon his imperialist ambitions, because history shows that he will not. And his ambition doesn't end in Donbass or Luhansk. It reaches deep into Europe, and it threatens our national security and our allies' security. Yes, we need our allies, and they have stepped up to aid Ukraine in this war. Appeasing Putin is a disservice to the brave men and women of our military who are defending our freedom all around the globe, because it puts them in greater risk if Putin thinks he can move against our NATO allies, and then we will be required to put our sons and daughters in harm's way. For 4 years, Ukraine has refused to bow to Putin's will. They have beaten back wave after wave after wave of Russian attacks. Our military gave them maybe a few weeks in 2022 to survive Putin's onslaught. They pushed the Russians back in those weeks after the first wave of assault, and they have continued a brilliant campaign of using new technology that has amazed and awed the world, including our own military, which is learning from Ukraine about the use of drones and other unmanned weapons platforms. Their ingenuity and determination are awe-inspiring, even as their stockpiles of interceptors and other air defense run dry. And we must provide the kind of military defense aid, the interceptors, the PAC-3s for the Patriot system, for the THAAD platform, that are essential to defend the Ukrainian people who are enduring night after night after night, missiles and drones killing civilians aimed at schools, hospitals, malls, civilian targets. Putin not only abducts children, he kills them in their beds as they sleep with missiles and drones that are aimed purposely at civilian targets to terrorize and intimidate the people of Ukraine. But they will not yield. And today they continue to stand as a beacon of hope and liberty, shining against the darkness. Today we cannot provide all that military aid that they need, but we can take this step, a step to stand with the people of Ukraine and show that their fight is our fight. I would like to close with some brilliant rhetorical flourish, but I'd rather just recall some of Senator Graham's last words to me. He said, "This is a big effing deal. We all did good." Decorum prevents me on the Senate floor from saying what he actually said. But I would like to say, looking across the chamber where he sat, that he is with us today and that he will be proud of what we are doing. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
The senator from New Hampshire, sorry.
Sponsors of this legislation, to remember Senator Lindsey Graham, to thank everyone who has worked so hard on this legislation, the Lindsey O. Graham Sanctioning Russia and Iran Act, and so appreciate Darlene Graham's being here and her support for this. So I'm here to support the underlying bill, but I also am here to oppose the Paul Wyden amendment. Now, I understand the concern of some of my colleagues on tariffs. I share those. I co-led an amicus brief challenging the president's illegal use of IEEPA to impose tariffs and appreciated Senator Wyden's partnership on that. That argument prevailed at the Supreme Court. I also oppose any abuse of the tariff authorities that are currently on the books. But the authority in this bill to impose tariffs is very narrowly scoped, and it contains clear guardrails. It explicitly says that the only countries that can be subject to tariffs are the top 5 purchasers of oil or gas, the top 5 sanctions evaders for Russian oil. So if we're going to be successful at putting pressure on that we need to put pressure on to get Vladimir Putin to the table, we've got to shut down the money that he's getting from oil and gas. And that's what this bill would do. These tariffs have one purpose: to make it more costly for countries to keep buying the Russian energy that funds Putin's war. This amendment does not restore Congress's constitutional authority over trade, which, listening to the authors, you might question. And if this amendment is adopted, President Trump's existing tariff authorities remain exactly where they are today. The only thing that would change would be our ability to put pressure on countries that are still buying Russian energy. So I oppose this amendment. I urge my colleagues to oppose it as well. And I think one of the critical issues here is the urgency of where we are in this war right now. The momentum is on Ukraine's side. This is Russia's worst summer of the war yet, but we know the situation can change quickly against Ukraine. China's supporting Russia's efforts to regain battlefield advantage by helping the Russians develop their own version of Starlink. One of the things President Zelensky raised a concern about the last time Senator Graham and I had a chance to meet with him in Ankara at the NATO summit. According to President Zelensky, that technology that China's working on could be available as early as November. That would advance Russia's drone technology to catch up with Ukraine. The battlefield could look significantly different in the next 6 to 12 months, and that could roll back Ukraine's advantages. Now is the time to put more pressure on Putin. This legislation, if it's advanced before the August recess, will be ahead of Russia's upcoming elections. They hold their legislative elections in mid-September. After that, Putin is likely to be required to change conscription in response to the severe shortage of recruits because they are losing 35,000 Russians a month. Advancing the legislation ahead of Russia's upcoming elections will increase pressure on Putin to seriously revisit prospects for a peace deal. And make no mistake, Russia is watching what we do. We have the history of this war to show that every time the United States backs away from putting pressure on Russia, from helping Ukraine, from funding the war, Russia ramps up its attacks in Ukraine. It kills more civilians. And that's where we are. If we can't shut down the funding for the war machine that Russia is using against Ukraine, then they're going to keep at it. We have to show the determination that the United States feels to support this emerging democracy that Senator Blumenthal was so eloquent to talk about. So that's why there's real urgency for what we're doing today. Not just to pass this underlying sanctions bill, but to make sure that the tariffs that are funding Russia's war machine can shut down the oil and gas that is keeping that war machine going. So I hope all of my colleagues will oppose this amendment and support the underlying bill. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, I want to join my colleague, the distinguished ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee. We're in the same spot on this bill and on the amendment. Just last week, I stood in this chamber and asked my colleagues to join me in moving this bill forward, and many of them from both sides of the aisle did so. That vote was successful with a margin of 86 to 12. That is a rare vote at this time in the Senate. That same night that we voted in tremendous support of Ukraine, a number of us welcomed Ukraine's president back to the Capitol, where he gave us a fulsome update on Ukraine's battlefield successes. He expressed how Ukraine sorely needed this sanctions legislation to magnify the impact of Russia's battlefield losses by imposing crippling economic costs on Russia's economy. This could finally bring Russia to the negotiating table and end this conflict, which we all want to see happen. But to be clear, while this legislation would help Ukraine counter Russian aggression, it also protects Idahoans, all Americans, but Idahoans who I focus on here, as all of us focus on our own constituents, and that is always each of our priority. Peace and stability in Europe are in America's interests. In the interconnected world we live in, prosperity in Europe only helps us here at home. Like everyone here, I always view what we're doing here through the lens of how will this affect my constituents at home? How will it help them? And bringing an end to this conflict will allow us to return to issues that Idahoans care about: lowering prices, unleashing domestic energy, protecting public lands, and building a better future for the next generation. This legislation brings us much closer to that end and an end to this conflict. It will make a decisive impact that goes beyond what can be achieved on the battlefield. It will cut off the flow of cash that powers Putin's war machine. I've worked with my colleagues on this bill for more than a year, including my friend from New Hampshire, with Senator Blumenthal, and of course with Senator Lindsey Graham, who was very focused on this bill, and with the President. I've worked particularly to include sanctions in this bill against Russia's illicit shadow fleet that it uses to evade existing sanctions and prop up its energy sector. These ships and the oil sales they facilitate directly fuel Russia's war machine and threaten American and European security. They enrich Russia, China, and Iran. This bill will go a long way to stopping that shadow fleet. I have also worked to include provisions taking aim at Russia's defense supply chains and a number of key energy projects causing real pain to Putin and those who keep him in power. They will do that. These tools will give the U.S. and our allies the leverage we need to force Russia back to the negotiating table and end this conflict. I would be remiss if I didn't note that this bill was a culmination of many, many hours of work from my staff, Senator Shaheen's staff, Senator Blumenthal's staff, Senator Lindsey Graham's staff. All of them and other staffs worked on this, and we usually don't thank them here on the floor, but they really need thanks on this because this went on so long and was so technical. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't note that this bill was a passion project for our friend Lindsey Graham, and it's fitting that we'll see it move through the Senate today. I hope to once again see a strong majority of my colleagues join us in this bill and passing this bill right here and right now. Thank you, Mr. President.
Order. The Senate will resume legislative session and consideration of H.R. 5334, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 454, H.R. 5334, an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 and so forth and for other purposes.
I call up amendment number 6711 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report the amendment by number.
The senator from South Carolina, Ms. Graham, for herself and Mr. Blumenthal, proposes an amendment numbered 6711.
The senator from Kentucky.
I call up amendment number 6715 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Kentucky, Mr. Paul, for himself and others, proposes an amendment numbered 6715 to amendment numbered 6711.
Mr. President,
The senator from Kentucky.
the bill before us contains the largest tax increase ever passed by a Republican Congress. Worse yet, the bill transfers the taxing authority from the legislature to the executive branch, an unconstitutional delegation of power. The Constitution clearly states that Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, and excises. Madison believed the Republic would survive only if the Constitution divided the power and pitted the executive ambition against legislative ambition. Madison would be horrified by the clamor of so many in Congress to cede the taxing authority. My amendment strips the transfer of the taxing authority from the bill. My amendment, if it passes, will demonstrate that Congress still has a spine, still has ambition, and still supports the separation and limitation of power.
Mr. President.
Who yields time in opposition?
Mr. President.
The senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, I ask for 2 minutes to be equally divided between myself and the senator from Connecticut.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the Senate has a spine. That's exactly what we're doing here today, is standing with a steel spine. We are standing against Putin's aggression. You saw this week him actually attack innocent Ukrainians. Ballistic drones go hit breweries. They hit innocent civilians working in warehouses. This is enough. Today we stand together to say we are going to cut off the flow of money to Putin. Senator Lindsey Graham said that this part, the part that our colleague from Kentucky wants to rip out, was actually the heart of this bill, that this was the way to hit Putin where it hurt most. Section 113 was carefully negotiated, and these authorities expire and are not permanent. Today, we send a message to Vladimir Putin, and we give President Trump the tools he needs to end this war.
Mr. President.
The senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate my colleague from Alabama's strong support for this bill. She has been instrumental in our reaching this point, and I thank her and Senator Graham of South Carolina. To state it really bluntly, Mr. President, this amendment kills the bill. It decimates the purposes of the bill, which has been the result of painstaking, sometimes painful negotiation over months with the White House, with our colleagues here, with the United States Trade Representative, whom I also thank for his cooperation and assistance. It would eliminate tariff provisions that have been narrowly constrained to the 5 largest purchasers of Russian oil and gas. It is not a broad blunderbuss provision. It is narrowly targeted, and no secret, the 2 largest purchasers, 90%, China and Russia. So let's be real here. This narrowly targeted tariff provision is essential to the bill. The choice isn't between this bill with tariffs and a bill without tariffs. The choice is between this bill or no bill. I oppose this amendment and urge my colleagues to vote no.
The question occurs on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Mr. Armstrong, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Thank you.